Hi, my name's Seeman. I'm going to talk about accessibility with CSS. Accessibility means making your web content accessible to people with disabilities, a minority if you like. Although actually not such a small minority, there are a huge number of people with disabilities. I think 1 in 10 needs special stuff, especially the aging community. It's actually, if you want to become a professional, large market web designer, you're going to run into it at some point as a requirement, because European Commission, any website made by the European Commission, any website in the States have ADD, disability access requirements. If you're making a website for US government, any federally funded sites, Australia, you're going to have to start at some point understanding accessibility. What I'm going to try and do is point out why CSS is basically fantastic for accessibility, some things you can do to break accessibility if you want to play games in CSS. And I'm also going to try and give you a feel at the same time of what accessibility is about. I'm not going to go through everything you have to do to make sites accessible. That's not appropriate. Only a few of the techniques in CSS. If you need to become accessible, you'll always be able to find out how to do it on going through the techniques, etc. What I'm going to try and give you is a general feel of what you're trying to achieve. What you're really trying to achieve is interoperability. Because accessibility for people with disabilities is the hardest case I can think of interoperable content. If you've made it accessible for every single assistive technology that's working for an audience of 5,000 people, some device you've never heard of, then you're accessible and you're interoperable. If you're not, if you've just got your use cases, you're going to support this browser and that browser under this scenario, then if someone's got some kind of, device, web device, attached to earpiece because they're underwater divers, it's not going to work for them. So there are always going to be use cases you haven't thought of. If it's accessible for people with disabilities, it's accessible. AT means assistive technology, and the reason why accessibility requires interoperability is because assistive technologies are tools that help people with disability. For instance, if someone's blind, visually impaired, they can't see the screen. So whatever pretty designs you've got there, they can't get to it. They might be using a screen reader. A screen reader reads the content of the site to them. It could be controlled back via mouse or via keypad. Via voice, not via mouse. They're not going to be able to use a mouse. So it has to be keyboard accessible, and the content has to be available for speech. Someone, on the other hand, who's got a visual impairment, but they're not blind, they might need a high contrast. They might need magnification. So it's a hell of a lot easier than using a screen reader or braille reader, but the devices are different. Got all these different devices, people with keypads because they can't use a mouse. Okay, so you have this story where you have people with disabilities, and my opinion, what's a disability is that we've built society in a way that not everyone can easily participate or can participate. If everyone was blind, they'd have no problem. If, on the other hand, everybody except for you had Asperger's syndrome, you'd be disabled. So, it's the majority who are building things, and they decide everyone can handle this. This is the easiest way to do it. They don't think about everyone particularly, and they make inaccessible stuff. Now, the internet came along, and this was awesome, because all of a sudden, you have electronic material, you have assistive technologies, you have everything out there, from making friends, going to the bank, working over the internet. Everyone can participate, except that people start playing these games. Instead of having text, they have pictures of text. Instead of having text box, they have pictures of text box. That means JavaScript fixed, they all change. Which, by the way, you can now do accessibly. But those kind of things broke it. So that's our damsel in distress, if you like, of the disabled communities. And nowadays, heroes, as we all know, tend to be geeky. And our hero in this case is the W3C, perfectly positioned hero to make the web accessible. Because what was needed was an integrated approach. We have a set of guidelines called WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. That's for, I think, most of the people here, how you make web content accessible when you're designing it. It works with every other specification. It works with user agents, which are making the stuff for the users. You tell them what to do, you tell them what to do, it works together. It's all open. Authoring tools also support that they should have inherent in their content. Why ARIA? How to make your toggling checkboxes and ants crawling across the screen accessible. And another group that I'm involved in is protocols and formats. We review every single W3 specification at draft stage to make sure that the backbone supports accessibility. So in other words, if you're using any W3C specification as it was intended, you're at least this close to being accessible, because the backbone, it's all integrated there. Backbone in W3 specifications for interoperability and accessibility, it can't pass. It can't get through to recommendation stage if it doesn't have some kind of level of accessibility. I'm nearly finished WCAG, then we move on to the CSS techniques. WCAG is split into different levels. You've got principles, which are like, they're kind of like the Asirat Hadibot, you know, thou shalt not make content inoperable, you know, which sounds completely right, but you've no idea how to do that. And then there's a level more, which says, you know, you shouldn't put the order in the page, in the DOM, you shouldn't break that. And that's, okay, got that. And then there's sexist criteria, which say how you can tell if you've done it. It's like a technology-independent test of what that really means to do. It's more like the how-to as opposed to the what. And techniques are the ultimate how. Techniques are technology-dependent techniques, which say, if you're in CSS, you can do this. If you're in HTML, you can do that. And what we're going to focus on is working techniques for CSS, but at the same time trying to give the big picture. And the big picture, the 4 principles, if you like, of accessibility as defined today. First is, it's perceivable. Content has to be perceivable. What does that mean? I have to be able to get to it. My assistive technology, or me, has to be able to get to the content. So for instance, if someone is making, putting content online, and they're really into old generation, it has to look perfect, and nothing else matters. They might make an image of all the text and stick that online, and it might have a beautiful font, but how is the user agent, how is the disabled person going to get that content? So you could say, okay, you have to have an alternative tag or a long description which has all the content in it. There are ways to get around that. But you have to make sure that the user has access to the content. Part of that is adaptability, 1.3. If your content's adaptable by other people, or by yourself even, by different technologies, it's accessible in terms of perceivability. Sure. Let's go back to my... I'm going to run with this example. Let's say I have a header. 2 ways of doing my pretty header 2, heading 2, right? My first one is I have a picture. A graphic artist gave me a picture of exactly what he wanted my heading 2 to look like. I stick that in an image tag, and that's my heading 2, very pretty. Okay, great. Can you adapt it? Can you change the contrast if you've got low vision? When you magnify it, does it magnify well? Properly, without getting fuzzed? Not really. If you magnify it a lot, is it going to go off the screen, and to read the end of each line, I've got to scroll widthwise? It's not accessible. It's not adaptable. If you've got beautiful CSS heading, you've got a heading that's tag heading 2. Class, very pretty text. And someone can expand it, someone can change the contrast to suit them. It can be red. It's adaptable. It's inherently adaptable content. more than that. Let's say I wanted to make an overview. Not everyone's great at English. Sometimes because of a disability, sometimes because they're not English, which could be considered a disability, of course. So if you wanted to make an overview, so people who don't want to read through hugely long documents on the line, they just want to zoom into where they want. So clickable overview automatically created. Can you do that with images? No. Can you do that with heading tags? Yes, I can pull out. Now let's say I've got a third-party application, and let's say I'm trying to search for relevant content on the question you asked, because I'm a search engine. How much priority, how much weighting do you give to certain key terms? If it's a heading 2, I can figure it out. If it's an image tag, it's an alternate image. It doesn't give me very much to go on to be able to process it. Knowledge processing works a lot better if your content's accessible, because it's adaptable. Next one, operable. If you can't use a damn thing, it's not really so good. Classic examples, your checkbox that you've done in a hugely clever way, no one can use a damn thing. Your menu bar at the top, you put your mouse over and a sub-menu pops up. What if you're not using a mouse? Not hugely operable unless you've made some kind of redundant keyboard accessibility, such as it works on mouse over and it works on some kind of key event. Then it's operable, because keyboard accessibility, you assume people have a on-off device, but it needs to be accessible via the focus and a tab order, because if you can only get to it via mouse, you cannot get to it. Okay, there's some examples of operable. Understandable. Things have to be understandable. Now, two things about understandability. One is you can enhance it, and CSS is fantastic for that. And you can break it. You can have a really nice visual site, and you can make it hugely gobbledygook for people who are not using a screen. For example, you use absolute positioning for your menu. So you've got your menu items, main menu, and then you've got the sub-menus at the bottom. So if you don't have the visual of the absolute positioning where they're sitting, you don't know what sub-menu belongs to what menu. You can do the same again for your items. You can have them all over the place. Tables, right? Tables are read sequentially, but sometimes the content has been split up between table cells, going vertically instead of horizontally. So let's say I've got my side menu, it might say About Us, and then I'll move to the next table cell, which might be Welcome to my site, I'm so glad to meet you, next thing will be Home, right? Because you jumped. It worked visually, but when you're not using the visual presentation, gobbledygook. So yeah, you can break understandability. And the third thing is robust. Don't depend for your basic content, and by content, by the way, I include structure. Structure to say something's a header, to say the relationship between content, that's not form, that's not pretty. You need to know that. You need to know where to look, focus, get to in a page. So it's got to be supported widely for your basic information on your basic content. So if a Microsoft new device comes along, and if you do this certain thing with IE that only IE support, it's less robust. Assistive technologies, if you have to buy a certain assistive technology to use it, you're less robust. So CSS and HTML, it's a beautiful combination. And CSS, it's an elegant idea, and I think this was something else that the previous presentation was getting to, which all emphasizes. What you do in CSS is you separate form and you separate content. You have your markup, which has your content. You have your CSS file, which has your form. Well, you can change the CSS file, but it's just elegant. And as soon as you start to mix them up and do clever things, you move away from an elegant, simple structure, which can be beautiful. So we have a CSS page where you've got the HTML doing HTML, you've got your CSS doing presentational attributes, and you've got something that's perceivable. It's inherently adaptable, because that's how you've chosen your technology. It's operable. Hopefully, it's understandable. Much more than with most other ways of making things pretty. And it's robust. Even if you take away the CSS, all you're doing is losing presentation. You're not losing core information that the user absolutely requires to work with. So we're going to go through a bit of CSS techniques, the good and the bad. So not so many bad things. I've done a mock-up of a web page just to show why CSS is beautiful. Very simple. My heading level 1 or heading level 2, in this case, consistent font all over the place, reinforces the structure, makes it more understandable. It's perceivable because the fact that the heading is in a tag, heading 1 tag or heading 2 tag, means that that structure is exposed to user agents or any other device that people are using. The heading 2 tags or heading 3 tags equally. The way you can, if you're using headers and fonts consistently, if you're using presentation to reinforce the structure, you're making it easier to understand. So understandability goes way up. Now here we made 2 classes, key points and tools. And I've used like the before for auto-generated content for the icons there. Now, these icons help understandability. Every time you come across a tool or key point, it's going to have the same little image popping up because that's just its class. It's going to be the same colors. You're not going to mess up. Different pages, same thing happening. So that helps with the understandability. You've got good structure. Someone can make a tool that can summarize. You can go through key points for each chapter that you're interested in. It's great to jump around. It's great for navigation. And these images are perfect images of auto-generated content in CSS. Why? Because all they are is a presentational aid that helps understandability. The content is the fact that it's tools or key points. The image just helps you see that quickly. You need less reading. You can just look for the next tool. It hits you in the face. And that enhances the structure and enhances understandability, but you don't clutter it with pictures which you then need. And a screen reader, if you put an alternative tag into here that said tool, the screen reader would get tool, tools. Yeah, not so helpful. But this is actually beautiful content to put in a CSS. Where it breaks is if that image actually said something that wasn't in the text. Then it's content. Then it's not just a visual aid. So the classic thing using and the CSS is basic CSS. Controlling a visual presentation through CSS is great for interoperability. When you used to use images to have your content, and sometimes you're going to do that, the marketing department won't give in on this one, but the more you can put your content as text, and now with CSS3, but even with CSS2, there was so much you can do in way of formatting, getting it to look just as you want it to look. It's completely adaptable and accessible. As soon as you put it in an image, you have a whole bunch of problems. You're heading in an image, not expandable, you can't change the focus. When you magnify it, it's sometimes a hell of a lot harder to read than easier. And remember the aging community. The aging community in the rest of the world, less than Israel, it's like an upside-down pyramid. More and more people are aging, the baby boomers are aging, and they're developing eye problems. Yeah. A lot of people are having more and more trouble, and they're having to set strong contrast. And also, as people nowadays are aging, they're savvy on the internet. They get the information on the internet. It's ridiculous not to be trying to reach this audience as much as possible. Okay, so here's an example, but, you know, start letter, stuff like that. But resizable text. Now here what I've done is instead of using pixels, I've used percentages or EMs, which is very similar. They're inherently accessible because they extend as you're, and they get bigger and smaller. They resize, that was the word, as you relative to each other. Now, what you can do with that, which is really nice, is you can also set the width of your main div or your table cell to a maximum number of EMs. What this means is that your content will scroll, will resize, it'll wrap. If you increase, you won't end up with people having to scroll horizontally to finish each sentence because they've magnified it so half of the sentences are off the screen. Padding, all this kind of thing. People use, you know, a pixel of a height in white space images of 1 pixel high. It's images, it's mess, it's noise, and it's not necessary. You can indent, you can handle a lot of stuff. Again, knowledge processing. People know what's going on. The more people know, can interpret what you're getting, the better. User interface. Again, we had in the previous presentation, seeing the user interface change as it received focus. That makes where you are on the page a lot more understandable. Because when you're using these forms and stuff and controls, if you don't see where your focus is, you often end up clicking a button that you didn't realize had focus. Or you start writing in the wrong textbook and it's not what you intended to do. Emphasizing focus is nice. Scripts. Okay. We'll start with the simple stuff. Accessible scripts. When you use the hiding content using a class, say, visible and a class invisible, and your JavaScript is toggling which class you're using. So you have a submenu, and when the item is, the main menu it has focus, the submenu pops up. It was there all the time, but it wasn't visible. So your class, the visibility changed when you controlled by the JavaScript. JavaScript breaks, or it's not supported by the CSS. The content is there. The only disadvantage is it never became invisible. You started off with it all being visible as the page loads. The first thing on load that your JavaScript does is hide it. But it only hides it. It doesn't remove it. So the content is all there. No content is being generated on the fly by JavaScript, which not everyone supports. So that's a beautiful way to minimize JavaScript dependency. Another thing, and this is a trick, but if you ever need to make an accessible website, you'll need it. One of US requirements, and now WorkX2 is requiring it too, is that there's some mechanism for people with disabilities to jump through all the submenus, not submenus, all the menus on the columns to the left of the page before you get to your main content. So all those sidebars. Because imagine you're having it read to you, or you're reading it in Braille sequentially. It can take 2 minutes to have the left-hand column of the right-hand column of the CNN site from whenever we tested it, not the latest version. It can take 2 minutes to get to the main content. And then you get to the main content, and it wasn't the page you were looking for. Brilliant. It's not a very pleasant experience. So what people do is sometimes they put a graphic there that says, with the alt tag, this is a link to it. It's linked and it says, jump to main text. But what you can, so you miss all the sidebars. What you can also do this in is in CSS. You can have your link there. It will get read by the screen readers, but the font is tweeny, and the background and text is the same color, and you just don't see it.
In HTML5, you have a marker and header, so you can't help
you have,
in
sorry?
this situation.
You have what?
In HTML5, you have an article tag that says here is the content.
You mean you have the role?
Tag that says where is the main. Like you put here a link.
Oh, the role.
You have the tag that says here is the
Yeah.
main content.
If
I
it's,
don't know
if it's supported by assistive technologies, as I said, the robust issue comes into play. So you can only use solutions that are assistive technologies. How can you know? Yeah, that's a good question. The why site is probably the best as to what things are supported and what isn't. Okay. That's fine. You don't go on the link. It's just if you want to jump over the sidebar. There's a link. You don't have to click it. You don't have to select it. And you can always press home, go to the top of the page, and start from the beginning. Okay, this is a specification of which I was the original author. So I'm very proud of it. This is for these Ajax exciting web applications that, they're coming. And original 1.0 WCAG said don't use scripts, and that's just not realistic when people want to move application interfaces onto the web. So one of the main problems, what was making scripts inherently inaccessible, was we had no semantics. HTML, a header is a header, a checkbox is a checkbox. When you get to, these very heavily script-dependent pages, a checkbox, might want to support mix. They're not using XFORM. So they might have 3 images of a checkbox, one that's checked, one that's not checked, one that's mixed. And the CSS changes it. Well, the assistive technology has very little way of knowing if it's a checkbox or not. The only thing you could possibly give them is the alt text. You can say checkbox. That's nice. It doesn't get focus. Images don't get focus. So one thing that was solved, and now they can with ARIA. The other thing is these states toggle. Right? You click on the checkbox and it's no longer selected. Okay, but let's say your default was, when you load the page, this thing's selected or it's mixed. Very typical. How the hell is assistive technology meant to know that the default for this image was actually checked? It's got a state, its state was checked, now it's not checked. How the hell is it meant to support these states that you've assigned to an image? It doesn't know what it is. It could be a picture of a tree. It just no information. So what we did was we created an ontology whereby you can add to your class, or whatever you wanted, state and ROM. And it's supported by all the different accessibility APIs of the operating system. Yeah. So in Firefox, it's apparently supported by IE. Dojo is using it. It's there. It was there because actually industry, it was very easy to get support because industry needed it. The IBM online in-demand interfaces, they couldn't sell to government. They couldn't sell to anything with federal funding because it had to be very accessible. And that was a killer. So actually they were very gung-ho of pushing people like Firefox. They sponsored people in Firefox to support it. At the first draft, before we even had an official working group draft, just an internal draft, we had already people on Firefox working to support it. Firefox is a free download. People know where it is. That makes it robust. So it's already robust enough for use in accessibility. So how you use CSS with it is when the event happens and clicks on this image, then your JavaScript can toggle the state and the class, which can change the image. Yeah.
Why not simply use native form elements and style them very easily? Look for custom elements, functional, accessible. They look exactly like the designer intended them to look.
Right.
They behave like the browser intended them to behave.
Yeah.
maybe I'm exaggerating, but this looks a bit like sin.
Okay. Firstly, when we started on this week, that you could not possibly do that kind of thing with CSS2. You couldn't do everything people were doing with CSS2. CSS3 is also trying to address the problem. There are two reasons. One is the achievements of ARIA filtered in to the different specifications, so that whatever we put down as our aims, they put down in their aims. So in the next generation, the idea of ARIA is to become redundant. We'd like it to be more native in the markup. It's something that we want to be robust, but we want it to become redundant, because absolutely, it's not, you prefer people to use the original markup. We said all over, if there's a way to do it in native markup, use the native markup. Here's the second thing. Everything that we do in ARIA, you ought to be able to do in Xforms. But in reality, people weren't going to use Xforms. There wasn't enough browser support. So this was a way of doing it that wasn't dependent on the browser support of Xforms. So actually, we stole a lot from Xforms, found a different way to do it, where we're not asking people to learn new technologies, really. We're just asking a change in technique of what they were using. And the third thing is you can retrofit. Not so easily because of the JavaScript, but you can retrofit what you've done in an application. And there's a final thing, is the ontologies behind it are extendable, which means often a spec's applying a bit of catch-up with what people are doing. So this way, accessibility doesn't need to play the same level of catch-up. As you're doing something inventive and creative and freedom of expression, you've got support here as well. And it fixed a lot of things, like images not being able to have focus. That was ridiculous. We wanted XML to change it. XML wasn't coming out with the change quickly enough, so we changed it. And then we also wrote an HTML1 module that you could just, that pulled an HTML, pulled an ARIA, and that was it. Okay, the bad. Inserting non-decorative content, it should be obvious by now. Content needs to be perceivable. So you might think you're very clever because you've got all your images coming from CSS backgrounds, or before or after, but you're losing everyone who isn't using that CSS and isn't using a screen with the color contrast that you've defined. You don't have any space for alternative text. And you can take this all the way. I've given an example there where real content, text on the screen, is being generated by a CSS, and it could look very pretty from a markup perspective. You can have a class Jim and a class Mary, and you don't put the Mary said this. You just have that auto-generated every time anything Mary says is in that class. A screen reader doesn't get that auto-generated text, so it's lost. Anyone who's not using CSS doesn't get that text. So essential content to understand what's going on needs to be in the code. That's how it's meant to be. Now, yeah.
Isn't this a problem with the screen reader in a way? Because it knows that it has an element and there is the CSS. Why can't he add the content before the...
Well, firstly, let's say you're using with an image, there's no support for it. And here's the interesting thing, right? We asked a couple of times, CSS, whenever you're putting in an image, to be able to say, have an alternative text. And every time they said no, absolutely not, go away. And their reasoning is they're not going to encourage people to use CSS wrong. CSS is presentational information. They don't want you to use CSS to generate content that isn't presentational. Using these icons of a tool by a div that's a tool, or something that's enhancing the structure, that's presentational. It wasn't content per se. They don't want to put in alternative ways of text behind an image generated by CSS because it shouldn't be there. So when you're doing that, you're breaking a text.
Not just screen readers, search engines.
Absolutely. Yeah. Anyone trying to process your text is not going to be looking for things that you are doing very cleverly. That's not what it's meant to be used for.
So why the content block in CSS?
Well, look how I used it. When I had my picture of a tool and my picture of...
I completely agree. Why have it? The CSS people don't want you to generate content in CSS. Why support the content block thing?
Did you see... Hold on, I'll just go down 2 slides, 3 slides. Here we go. This is why. Okay? Here I have tools and I have key points. Now, the text color or something, whenever anything's in a class tool, and it'll have a heading 3. But I would like tools to look different from key points, so I have a class tool, and anything that's got this class is going to have maybe different format to there, and is going to have auto-generated content of this image. Now, having it auto-generated saves you time, right? Because it always comes in, makes it look more consistent. No one's going to take the wrong image. It's auto-generated. All you need to know is that you need to use the class tools and whatever format information, including this, because this is redundant. This says tools. This gives you a visual representation to help you find it quicker. That's how you're meant to use it before.
I agree, but that's background image.
That's background image,
So
exactly.
I'm asking about the content. You write P before, and then you write content dot, and then something.
I think it's meant to be used in the same kind of spirit as redundant content that reinforces.
It doesn't organize.
But I think the specifications clearly say it's meant to be used for presentation. Okay, another bad thing. I'm sure you've come across it. P class heading 1. Instead of using heading 1 tag, they think, oh, I can do this in CSS. And they use a paragraph tag, class heading 1. You've lost content in your markup, and that content is that it's a heading 1. That's content, it's structure. You need to know it. The search engines, anyone using that who isn't seeing it is not going to know it's a header. And you want everyone to know that, not just people looking at it with your CSS. Image class button. Use the button tag. They're there. It's not, format. CSS is presentational. And accessibility means that it's instructable. All right, next bad thing. Absolute positioning used with care. What we've got here is the example of the menu that I pulled up before. You've got menu items, and you stagger them in convenient groups in the DOM. DOM, Document Object Model. Do people know what that is? When you pass through a web page, when you're loading it, you load it into like a tree. This contains that tag, contains that tag. There's some nemesis to the document object model, like for instance, document right, because it's being generated after this tree was formed, so no one really knows what's going on with it. You use the element tag, create a new element. People know where to stick it in a DOM. Here's another thing. If you've got the position of your content outside your DOM, and it's not consistent with the way it looks, it's not understandable anymore.
How is it positioned outside the DOM?
Okay, let's, well, this is how it does work. Let's say I had menu items for my top menu, and then underneath it I had each item, sub-menu of items. You have a tree or something like that, right? Folder, options, files. So you might have your files, your main folders. You click on it, you get the file list, right? Now, what you do when you load the site, if you're bad, is you'll first put all your files, and then after you've done all your, you first put all your folders, which are the containers, and then after that, you would put the items in the different folders, one after the other. In other words, your folder is not next to the items in the folder, but they're visually positioned to look like they're under when you click on it. stops making sense. So this is an idea where they've done it in such a way that the DOM is not broken. That's good. So the CSS is a positioning. It should not be responsible for the content or the structure. It's just the look. You shouldn't be making your structure via CSS because it's just presentation. So coming back to our original thing, CSS is beautiful when it's used for form, not when it's used for content, but for presentation. Okay, presentation is fantastic to do in CSS. It's elegant. But when you mix up these two concepts, you get a very complicated, or difficult to understand content. That's it.